Hey everyone, welcome back. Ready for another deep dive?
Always ready to jump into the deep end.
Perfect, because today we've got some pretty intense breaking legal news to unpack. It revolves around the 2020 election interference case in Georgia, specifically the one against Donald Trump.
Definitely a headline grabber. What's the latest development?
Well, the Georgia Appeals Court just dropped a bombshell. They decided to remove Fulton County District Attorney Fani Willis from the case.
Oh, wow, that's a big deal. What's the reasoning behind that?
It all boils down to a conflict of interest. Apparently, Willis allegedly had a romantic relationship with a former special prosecutor who was involved in this case.
That's certainly a tangled web.
Yeah.
And the court felt this was serious enough to pull her off the case entirely.
Absolutely. They basically said this whole situation casts a serious shadow of doubt over the investigation. To quote them directly, "This is the rare case disqualification is mandated, and we want to restore the integrity of these proceedings."
Strong words. So what does this mean for the case moving forward?
Honestly, it's a bit of a legal free-for-all right now. We've got this major legal curveball, a removed prosecutor, and the future of the entire investigation hanging in the balance. You've been following this story closely. What stands out to you the most?
I think what grabs my attention is that phrase, apparent conflict of interest. It seems like they're not necessarily saying Willis did anything intentionally wrong, but that even the appearance of wrongdoing is enough to damage the case's credibility.
Yeah, it's like they're saying it doesn't really matter if there was actual wrongdoing or not. It just looks bad, and that's enough to raise serious doubts about the fairness of the whole thing.
Exactly. And, they specifically say they're worried that this perceived conflict of interest might have influenced decisions beyond just the indictment, like who to charge and what charges to bring.
So it's not just about whether the indictment itself was fair, but the entire process leading up to it. Wow, this could potentially have a domino effect on everything.
That's what makes this ruling so significant. It goes beyond Fani Willis. It's about how conflicts of interest can impact any high-profile case. And let's be real, this case is as high profile as it gets. I mean, we're talking about a former president here, a man who thrives on controversy. How do you think this ruling plays into his narrative?
Oh, it's definitely ammunition for Trump and his supporters. They've been saying all along he's the victim of a political witch hunt, and now they have something concrete to point to.
Precisely. Sadly, there are a lot of people who will eat that up. It just adds to the existing polarization and distrust in our political landscape.
It's like pouring fuel on a fire that's already raging. The potential for further division and animosity is pretty concerning.
And it raises serious questions about whether the justice system, even when striving for impartiality, can actually handle something this politically charged.
It's like walking a tightrope during an earthquake.
Quite the image. But yeah, that sums it up pretty well.
So if Willis is out, what happens now? Who takes over? Does the case just get passed to someone else?
Theoretically, another prosecutor in Georgia could pick it up. But here's the catch. Earlier this year, that same office chose not to pursue similar charges against Lieutenant Governor Burt Jones, even though he was also implicated in this whole election interference scheme.
So they already said no once. Why would they change their minds now, especially with all this new drama?
That's the million-dollar question. It feels like trying to put spilled milk back in the bottle at this point.
Okay, so we've got a removed prosecutor, a bunch of defendants in limbo, and a whole lot of uncertainty. Where do we go from here?
Well, Willis could appeal to the Georgia Supreme Court, hoping to get back on the case. However, it's worth noting that the court leans conservative.
So even if she appeals, there's no guarantee they'll rule in her favor. What other options are on the table?
The case could also be reassigned to a different prosecutor, but, as we mentioned, that other office already passed on similar charges earlier.
So is it appeal or bust? It sounds like the future of this whole case is hanging by a very thin thread.
That's a good way to put it. This ruling has created a massive amount of uncertainty.
And to think, it all stems from a personal relationship. It's a stark reminder that even in the seemingly rigid world of law, personal matters can have a major impact.
Absolutely. This case really highlights how even a seemingly small detail can spiral into huge consequences, especially in such a high-stakes legal battle.
It's certainly been a wild ride so far, and we're just getting started. But before we dive deeper into the legal weeds, let's take a step back and break down what just happened. We've got this major legal twist, a prosecutor removed from the case, and the future of the entire investigation hanging in the balance. What are your initial thoughts on all of this?
Well, one thing that jumps out at me is that the court was very specific in its reasoning for removing Willis. They're worried that this perceived conflict of interest might have influenced decisions beyond just the indictment, like who to charge and how to charge them.
Right, so the implications reach far beyond just the indictment itself. It really calls into question the integrity of the entire process.
And that's what makes this situation so unique and potentially impactful. It's not just about the specifics of this case, but about the broader implications for how conflicts of interest can affect high-profile legal cases moving forward.
That's a great point. It raises some crucial questions about the delicate balance between personal relationships and professional responsibilities, especially in positions of power.
It certainly does.
Mm.
And this case really shines a spotlight on the challenges our legal system faces in navigating these complexities.
It's definitely a lot to unpack, and we're just scratching the surface here. But before we get too deep into the legal weeds, I think it's important to acknowledge the human element at the heart of this story.
You're absolutely right. It's so easy to get lost in the legal and political jargon. But we can't forget that real people's lives are being impacted by these events.
Absolutely. At the end of the day, this isn't just some abstract legal battle. It's about individuals who were allegedly harmed, individuals whose lives and careers are now hanging in the balance, and it's about the trust we place in our institutions to uphold justice and fairness.
Well said. It's a powerful reminder that the law, while it strives for objectivity, is ultimately a human construct shaped by the very people who administer and interpret it.
And that makes it all the more important for us to engage in these conversations, to hold our systems accountable, and to demand transparency and integrity from those in positions of power.
Couldn't agree more. It's these conversations, these deep dives into complex issues, that help us as a society understand the challenges we face and work towards solutions.
Absolutely, and that's what we're here to do. So let's take a deeper look at the possible ramifications of this ruling. What might happen to the other 15 defendants caught up in this case? Do they all just walk free now?
Well, it's not quite that simple. While this ruling undoubtedly creates opportunities for them, their legal fates are still very much up in the air.
So instead of facing a unified front, they're more likely to splinter off and try to save themselves.
That's a very real possibility. It's like a game of legal chess, with each player now looking to make the best move to protect their own interests. And don't forget, even if this specific Georgia case falls apart, Trump still has other legal battles looming. He's facing those federal charges related to January 6th, and the New York case involving his business dealings is ongoing.
So even if he sidesteps this one, he's got a long road ahead of him.
Absolutely. But this ruling in Georgia could embolden him and his legal team. It's like they've tasted victory, and now they might be even more aggressive in challenging the charges against him in those other cases.
It sounds like we're in for a long and complicated legal battle, with twists and turns we can't even begin to predict.
That's the nature of these high-profile cases, isn't it? We're dealing with powerful figures, complex legal arguments, and intense public scrutiny. It's a recipe for a legal drama unlike anything we've seen before.
Okay, before we get overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of this whole situation, let's shift gears for a moment and talk about RICO cases. You mentioned earlier that this ruling was especially significant in the context of a RICO case. Can you explain why that is?
Sure. RICO cases are unique because they're not about proving a single crime. They're about establishing a pattern of criminal activity, a conspiracy involving multiple people working together to achieve a common criminal goal.
So it's not just about individual acts, but about connecting the dots to reveal a larger criminal enterprise.
Exactly. And this makes RICO cases incredibly complex, both from a legal and logistical standpoint. Prosecutors have to build a very strong case, weaving together evidence from multiple sources, and convince a jury that all of these different individuals were acting in concert.
And this ruling throws a wrench into that whole process.
It certainly does. By raising doubts about the integrity of the investigation and the fairness of the process, it creates a massive cloud of uncertainty, not just for Trump, but for all of the defendants involved.
It's almost like a legal earthquake, shaking the foundations of the entire case.
That's a great way to put it. The landscape of this case has shifted dramatically, and the aftershocks are still reverberating.
All right, before we get too bogged down in the legal complexities, let's take a moment to remember that at the heart of this case are real people whose lives have been deeply affected by what allegedly happened.
You're absolutely right. It's easy to get caught up in the legal drama, but we cannot lose sight of the human impact. There are individuals who were allegedly harmed by the actions at the center of this case, and their voices deserve to be heard.
And what about Fani Willis? She's at the center of this legal and political maelstrom. Regardless of what the court decides, this situation has undoubtedly presented a significant professional and personal challenge for her.
Absolutely. This case has put her under intense scrutiny, and regardless of the outcome, her career and reputation will likely be forever intertwined with it.
It's a stark reminder that even those in positions of power are human, subject to scrutiny and the consequences of their decisions.
It certainly is. And this case highlights the immense pressure and responsibility that comes with positions of authority, especially in the legal system.
Well, we've certainly covered a lot of ground today, and it's clear that this story is far from over. We've got a removed prosecutor, 16 defendants in various states of legal limbo, and a whole lot of uncertainty about what happens next.
You've summarized it perfectly. The legal and political landscape of this case has shifted dramatically, and it will be fascinating to see how it all unfolds in the coming weeks and months.
Absolutely. And as this saga continues, we'll be here to break it all down for you, exploring the legal arguments, the political maneuvers, and the human stories at the heart of it all.
Stay tuned, folks. This roller coaster ride is just getting started.
Indeed it is. But before we go any further, let's shift our focus to something that's been weighing heavily on my mind. This case has obviously sparked a lot of public debate, and it seems like everyone has an opinion on it. But how do we, as citizens, as consumers of information, navigate this incredibly complex and often overwhelming media landscape?
That's a crucial question, especially in today's world, where information, misinformation, and disinformation are constantly vying for our attention.
It feels like we're bombarded with so much information from so many different sources that it's hard to know what to believe or who to trust.
I completely agree. And that's why it's more important than ever to be critical thinkers, to approach information with a healthy dose of skepticism, and to be willing to engage in respectful dialogue with those who hold different viewpoints.
So, what are some practical tips for navigating this information overload? What advice would you give to our listeners who are trying to make sense of it all?
Well, first and foremost, be wary of headlines and social media posts designed to elicit strong emotional reactions. Those are often crafted to grab your attention and spread quickly, but they may not provide the full context or accurate information.
So basically, don't just react, reflect.
Exactly. Take a moment to pause, breathe, and consider the source of the information. Is it a reputable news outlet, a well-respected journalist, or is it a random social media account with an agenda?
Right, because not all sources are created equal.
Exactly. And even when you're dealing with a reputable source, it's important to remember that journalists are human, and they can make mistakes. So, cross-check information with multiple sources, look for evidence-based reporting, and be open to the possibility that the full story might be more nuanced than the initial headlines suggest.
It's almost like being a detective, piecing together the truth from fragments of information.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
And it's also crucial to be aware of your own biases. We all come to the table with our own preconceived notions and beliefs, and it's important to recognize how those might be shaping our interpretation of the information we encounter.
So be mindful of your own filters.
Precisely. And remember, it's okay to disagree respectfully. We can have productive conversations about complex issues without resorting to name-calling or personal attacks.
I couldn't agree more. Civil discourse is crucial for a healthy democracy.
It truly is. And in the context of this particular case, where emotions are running high and the stakes are so incredibly significant, it's even more important for us to approach these conversations with empathy, understanding, and a willingness to listen to perspectives that might differ from our own.
Well said. Now, let's take a step back and consider the larger implications of this case for American democracy. Regardless of the outcome, it seems like this whole situation has exposed some deep divisions in our society and raised some serious questions about the integrity of our electoral processes.
You're absolutely right. It's almost like a stress test for our democracy, revealing both its strengths and its vulnerabilities.
It feels like a defining moment, a crossroads where we need to decide what kind of country we want to be.
And the outcome of this case, the way it unfolds, the precedents it sets, will have a lasting impact on how we conduct elections, how we hold our leaders accountable, and how we define the very essence of the rule of law in this country.
It's a lot for our justice system to bear, and a lot for us as citizens to grapple with.
Indeed. The stakes are incredibly high. And it's up to all of us to engage in these conversations, to hold our leaders accountable, and to ensure that our democracy emerges from this challenge stronger and more resilient than ever before.
We can't afford to be complacent or apathetic. The future of our democracy depends on our active participation and our unwavering commitment to the principles of justice and fairness.
Absolutely. We all have a role to play in shaping the future of our nation. And it starts with staying informed, engaging in thoughtful dialogue, and holding those in power accountable.
Well said. Now, let's dive into one particular aspect of this case that has sparked a lot of